here is the essence of the methodology of Torah, and how how Torah preserves itself from becoming atrophied into a dogmatic, fundamentalist set of laws that would stifle any development. And how, as we've spoken before, in the idea of Lasuk Yishmaitz Aliba de Hilchas, what the Gemara does is it preserves authenticity and fluidity. If you don't have fluidity in halakha, then it becomes atrophied. If you don't have authenticity in halakha, then it becomes a reformation, then it's nothing. And that's the challenge, is how do you preserve authenticity and fluidity? And the key is Gemara. Gemara links everything we have back to the Torah Shebichtav, back to the written law, and that guarantees authenticity. And it teaches us a methodology by which to apply everything that we have to current situations throughout the ages. And it's that balance that we have to keep. And we have a piece of Gemara at the bottom of Lamed Beis, which is not directly related to the sugya as much, but just important ideas in it. The Mishnah talks about Hevilu et Tamid Karatzor. They bring the Korban Tamid, the daily Korban, to the Kohen and his Karatzor. Ask the Gemara, my Karatzor, what is that? What does he do? What does Karatzor mean? Amar Ula Lishna Diktalahu. It means he slaughters it. That's what it means. Omar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak asks, my crow, where's the posuk? This is back to the authenticity. So how do you know from the Torah that the word Karatzor means to shecht? So he answers, Omar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, from the posuk in Yirmiyahu, Egla Yefeifiya Mitzrayim Keretz Mitzafon Bava. The Mitzrayim is a beautiful calf, and a killer from the north, meaning the Babylonians, the custom is surely coming. Ask the Gemara, how do you know that the word keretz means killer? So we're dealing with the real first principles. It's so interesting. The Gemara is like learning the Chumash like a child. What the Tanakh? What does keretz mean? So you could say, well, look at the Metzudas Tzion, look at the Metzudas David, you'll see what it means. No, they didn't have all that. They're working from first principles. How do you know what the word keretz means? And here the Mishnah uses the word keretz, so it's important we know it. Answers the Gemara, the Metargim Rav Yosef, as Rav Yosef translated it. Now Rav Yosef is, as you know, a really important Amorah from the third generation of Amoraim in Babylon. He and Rabbah are very close. There was a contest as to who should become Rosh Yeshiva in Pumbedita. Rav Yosef puts Rabbah forward. He was much younger. Rabbah was only 18 at the time. And Rabbah becomes the Rosh Yeshiva of Pumbedita until he dies. And then Rav Yosef is Rosh Yeshiva for a couple of years. And Rav Yosef is one of the Rabbeim of Rava. So we've got Rabbah and then Rava and Abaya. Rabbah and Rav Yosef are from the same generation. Rava and Abaya are the next generation. And this is the foundation of the Talmud. This is the foundation of the Gemara. So this same Rav Yosef, who was blind, says, Malke Yai Havi Mitzrayim. He translates the posuk into Aramaic. Amamim Ktulin Mitzifona Yeton Allah. A deadly nation will come from the north to attack it. And that's virtually word for word the Targum Yonasan that we have. Targum Yonasan is the first Babylonian translation, or the first Aramaic translation of the Tanakh, and we need to understand who the Yonasan was. So I've brought you some of the Gemaras that you understand who this Yonatan ben Uziel was. He was from the first generation of Tanaim, the beginning of the Mishnaic period, so very, very powerfully authoritative. And the Gemara says in Sukkah, Daf Chavchet, the Shmonim Talmidim hayu lo leHillel HaZaken. Hillel HaZaken had 80 Talmidim, 80 disciples. Shloshim mehem ru'uyim shetishrei aleim Shechina k'Moshe Rabbeinu. 30 of them were fit to have the Shechina rest on them like Moshe Rabbeinu. Imagine this yeshiva, 30 students out of the 80 are of the stature of a Moshe Rabbeinu. U'shloshim mehem ru'uyim shetamad lehem Chamok Yoshua bin Nun. And 30 of them had the power and the moral character to get the sun to stop the way Yeshua did. This is who we're dealing with, sitting in Hillel HaZaken's Beit Midrash. Esrim Beinonim, and then there were 20 kind of mediocre people in between somewhere that weren't so great. Gadol Shebekulan, the greatest of all of these people, Yonatan ben Uziel. Katan Shebekulan, who was the most junior of all the people in the Beit Midrash? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So you've got to get a sense and an idea of who these people were that formulated the Mishnah. And Yonatan ben Uziel is one of them who translates. We use it every day, Yonatan ben Uziel, to understand Tanakh. And furthermore, there's a Gemara in Megillah that talks about the fact that the Chumash was translated by Unkelus Hager, Unkelus the convert. And the Nevi'im, Nach, was translated by Yonatan ben Uziel, which he heard and learned from Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So Yonatan ben Uziel's Targum comes from the Nevi'im themselves. Yatzta bat kol v'amra, when he translated the Tanakh, a bat kol, a heavenly voice came out and said, Mi uzeh shegila sitrai levnei Adam. Who is this who revealed my secrets of the Torah to Bnei Yisrael, who wrote it down in this new translation? And Art Scroll's done a wonderful work, but when Art Scroll got translated, there wasn't a bat kol. The heavenly voice didn't come out and say, who's revealed the secrets? When Yonatan ben Uziel made the first translation, a bat kol came. That's how great it was. Omad Araglav, he stood on his feet and he said, that's me. I take accountability. I wrote this. Galuvi adu lefanecha, but you know very well, shelo lichvodi asiti, I didn't do this for my honor, velo lichvod Beit Abba, not for my family's honor, ela lichvodcha asiti, shelo yarbu machloket b'Yisrael, I did this for you, Hashem, so that there won't be argument in Yisrael. There's an authoritative translation of the Tanakh, and we all know what it means. Then he wanted to continue writing the translation of Ktuvim, Tehillim, and so on. And the bat kol came out and said, Yonatan ben Uziel, enough. No more writing translations. My time in Mishum Deit Beketz Mashiach, because that has the end of the world and Mashiach, that should not be translated. Says the Ritva on that piece in Megillah, what's Rav Yosef got to do with this? Why does the Gemara bring Rav Yosef? Says the Gemara, Rav Yosef the Asiku Mairi betargum tuba bechol duchta. If you check through Shas, you'll see often there is a linkage between Rav Yosef and Targum Yonatan. Rav Yosef often uses Targum Yonatan to explain the psukim. Why is that so? Mishum davi saginav, because Rav Yosef was blind. And he isn't allowed to recite Tanakh by heart. As we'll see, that's a halacha. So he learned the Targum. He learned Yonatan ben Uziel's Targum so that he could quote from Tanakh without being over the principle that you're not allowed to quote from the Tanakh Baal Peh. You've got to read it out of the book. You're not allowed to say it by heart. And that's a piece that comes from the Gemara in Gittin Daf Samach. Dvarim shebichtev yat harashai lo omran al peh, dvarim shebal peh yat harashai lo omran bichtav. The written things you shouldn't say orally, and oral things you shouldn't say written. The Torah is divided into Torah shebichtav and Torah shebal peh, written Torah and oral Torah, and they need to stay written and oral. Don't mix up the methods. And further on, Rabbi Yochanan says, Lo karat HaKadosh Baruch Hu britim Yisrael ela bishvil dvarim shebal peh. Hashem's covenant with Yisrael is all for the oral law. The essence of everything is Gemara. The essence of everything is the oral law. But we have these two pieces of halacha. And Rashi says there on Gittin, the only reason the Talmud could be published and written down is for fear that it would be forgotten otherwise. But ideally it shouldn't be written down. And that's why it's written down in shortened form, as little as possible, write down as little as possible. So you have to reconstruct it, using a Rebbe, being taught how to, and methodology. You have to reconstruct it, that's how it's written, so that it remains at least to some degree oral. And you've got, I've mentioned to you before, I think the reason that the Vilna Gaon writes in such brief, literally just references, very brief, is because he's writing down Torah shebichtav, he's writing down the oral law, and he wanted to just write down as much as he needed to remember what he was thinking. So it's just hints, and the Gemara itself is like that, just hints. And you've got to reconstruct and flesh the Gemara out in order to make sense of it, because it's Torah shebal peh, it's not Torah shebichtav. Now, why this complete separation? The Maharal speaks about that, and I've brought it for you again, so that you can use it. And as I say, I think this is Shavuos learning, because it's so important for what the Torah is. And in short, the Maharal gives two reasons for this distinction between Torah shebichtav, which has to remain written, and Torah shebal peh, which can only be said Baal Peh and shouldn't be written. And he says, firstly, Torah shebichtav is a unified, integrated system. You can't take a piece out of it. A piece out of it is no longer emet. Emet is just the whole thing. And he says, when you speak consecutively. So you're saying something. Why you're saying that something? You're not saying anything else. So when you speak, you're taking chunks and you're addressing pieces of the Torah. And the Torah should not be dismantled into pieces. When you have a whole Chumash in front of you and you're reading out of the Chumash, it's clear to you and everybody else that this is part of an integrated whole. So it's important to keep that integrity of the Torah, which is what Torah Shebichtav is. Torah Shebichtav is the system. It's the operating system. And you can't dismantle an operating system because then nothing works. So the Torah Shebichtav is the coding. It's all there, and the coding has to remain in writing. You can't code and just remember it by heart. You've got to put it into the computer, otherwise it doesn't work. The coding of the Torah has to be in writing. But the Torah Sheba'al Peh is, the oral law is endless. That's Ein Sof. It's always evolving. You don't want to write that down, because once you write it down, it becomes fixed. That was the objection to writing the Shulchan Aruch down, and people's objection to writing, for the Rambam's writing the Rambam down. Once you write it down, it becomes dogma. And then people, what are you supposed to do? They look up. What am I supposed to do today? You look up. I've got a shaila, look up. And you're just taking information from a body of fundamentalist dogma, instead of working it out, reasoning, looking at the context, looking at the time, applying the method of thinking to the context and time. That's Torah Sheba'al Peh. You don't want that written down, says the Maral, other than, as Rashi says, just because we're afraid of things getting forgotten, so they got written down. But they shouldn't be learnt that way. They need to be learnt, spoken out, and talked about, and taught from Rebbe to Talmud. This is not something that you look at a book. This is not something you Google. Imagine what Chazal would have said about Google. If you can't even write it in a book, imagine how we decompose the Torah by just looking something up in Google and getting the answer on that specific thing without any sense of the system and the integrity. The second thing that the Maharal says is the Torah gives us the principles of halacha, and the Torah Sheba'al Peh gives us the application. And he says it's like saying, what is a house? So you say a house is a thing with 4 walls and a roof, and it protects you from the elements. That's what a house is. That's Torah Shebichtav. What is Sukkot? What is Pesach? It tells you what it is in fundamental principle. But how do you design a house so that it's usable to you in your situation, for your needs, in your climate? That each one is different when you get to the design. Says the Maharal Miprag, the Torah Shebichtav is the principle. It's a house, it's the concept. Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, is how to design it in a way that makes sense to you, how to design it in a way that makes sense to your generation, to your place, to your time, and gives it context. You don't want to write that down, because that has to evolve. That has to change. That has to develop all the time. So Torah Sheba'al Peh is fluid. Torah Shebichtav is rigid. Torah Shebichtav is an integrated system. Torah Sheba'al Peh is unlimited. Torah Shebichtav is the principle. Torah Sheba'al Peh is the design and the application for each period and era in which we live. And we need to keep that balance. Whenever we're learning, we've got to make sure that we're linking back to the Torah. And that's what the Gemara does all the time. Every halacha, the Vilna Gaon writes it. Everything you learn, you should be able to link back to its source in the Torah to preserve its authenticity. And you've got to be able to apply the reasoning of the Gemara to preserve its fluidity and its ability to apply and to be designed in a way that authentically fits the time and the era of each period in which it's used and learned.